We've just gotten our first look at the PlayStation 5 as well as the PlayStation 5 Digital Edition. And that is how you do a launch event. With millions of people watching the live event across YouTube and Twitch, we got not only details about a ton of new games, but also on the PlayStation 5 itself. We finally know what this console looks like, and I gotta say, it looks like, to me, it looks like one of those concepts that we've seen forever with all of the white plastic and sort of that interesting shape, especially when you look at the digital edition compared to the standard PS5, where it kind of has that tapered shape where you don't have the disc drive. Super interesting though, and especially when you see it side by side with that DualSense controller. Obviously, this is going to be a much, much smaller and realistically better looking console than the Series X.
It also looks like an Alienware computer.
It does look like an Alienware computer. Now obviously games were first and foremost today at the event, although of course we did only see them at 1080p 30, which is fine, but not really showing off the best of the console. However, it was very clear that a lot of these games were a cut above anything that you could see on the PS4. So things like ray tracing were in almost every single game we saw. I'm assuming a lot of these games are also going to be taking advantage of some higher frame rates. But the thing that really jumped out to me is that unlike the Xbox event from last month, Sony came out swinging. There were, by my count, probably almost 20 different games that they showed, and a lot of them were from very big franchises. We got Gran Turismo 7, we got a brand new Resident Evil game, we got a ton of newer IPs, which is always nice to see at the beginning of a console generation. There was just so much for pretty much anyone on this one. And we got to see the console!
Why are there two? Why are there two? Is this the place?
Digital.
Some games, like Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, did a very good job of showing off several new aspects of the PS5. Not only, of course, did you see ray tracing with the excellent looking lighting, but they also showed off the speed of the SSD by taking advantage of that rift mechanic, which allow you to kind of warp around, and obviously that would not be something that would be possible on something like the PS4. Something else that looked great is Kena Bridge of Spirits, which when I first saw it, straight up looked like a Pixar movie from just a few years ago. Now what's impressive about all of these games is that they are running on real PS5 hardware. Now, mind you, there's still development kits, so there's some room, some wiggle room, I guess. But what I really appreciate here is that we didn't just see a lot of trailers. We saw a few trailers, but pretty much everything was running in engine on the consoles, and a lot of what we saw today was actual real gameplay, which I think bodes well. So they did show off a fair few accessories, including a new 3D camera, but I think it's very interesting to think that Sony this time around are really going first and foremost with a digital edition of the PS5. Obviously, the Xbox has been doing this for a little while with the Xbox One S All Digital, which was the lower end Xbox One that didn't have the disc drive, that was a little bit cheaper. That was a little bit of a weird console, but this time around it seems like Sony is very much focusing on having what I assume is at least a $50 cheaper PlayStation 5 digital edition if you're not going to be using the discs. And let's be sort of real here, how many people are actually going to buy PS5 discs, especially considering that these games are like 100 gigabytes, right? Are you actually gonna buy the discs?
Yeah, man.
Really?
And I want a 4K Blu-ray player.
Now, of course, there are advantages to that disc drive beyond just the pure games. We do finally have support for 4K Blu-ray, but realistically, I feel like the discless version is probably going to be the more popular one. But it does depend on how much cheaper it is. Are we looking at a $550 PlayStation 5 and a $500 PS5? We still don't know. At least people on Twitter very much seem to be on board with the PS5. I am pretty firmly in the camp of I like it. It looks different, it looks unique, but it does definitely move forward from the PS4, which I was never really a big fan of the particular design of. And while the Series X is obviously a very powerful console with a lot of sort of hardware specs, ultimately it's a big black box, so, you know.
We can't stack anything on top of it anymore.
Yeah, but don't stack things on your console. Throughout the entire event, Sony were teasing little bits and pieces of the PS5 experience, and we did get a little bit of a look at the startup animation. But that being said, there are a lot of things that we still have not seen with the PS5. Obviously, I'm very excited. We finally got to see what this thing really looks like. But ultimately, there's still a lot of questions and there's still a lot of things that we still need to find out about what this PS5 is really capable of. Of course, we've already seen some PlayStation 5 gameplay thanks to the Unreal Engine 5 tech demo. Now, as it's a tech demo, you always have to take this stuff with a grain of salt. This is meant to show off everything in the best possible light, pun intended, but it's not always necessarily representative of what the final gameplay will look like. That being said though, it is clear that these new consoles have a lot of very fun toys to play with. The lighting particularly looks really impressive with the ray tracing, and obviously those ridiculous textures that UE5 supports, while they will absolutely destroy your 825GB little PS5 SSD, are really cool to see. The only downside here is that this really was framed as a PS5 thing, and while yes, this demo is running in real time on PS5 dev hardware, there is absolutely nothing to say that this cannot and would not run on the Xbox Series X. So the specs have been known for a couple of months now, and if you're a PC gamer, you will be very familiar. So just like with the PlayStation 4, Sony is taking advantage of a full AMD architecture. This time around, it means that they are taking advantage of 8 Zen 2 CPU cores, which on the Ryzen side really has shaken up the gaming PC industry, so it's very nice to see this come over to the consoles. Performance-wise, we're expecting a major jump here, and it will enable a lot of new things. So the current generation consoles had good graphics, but the processors were incredibly weak, which really sort of hamstrung certain things would look really good, but then when you look at other aspects of a game, such as the simulation, such as the physics, such as the size of the sheer world and everything in it, it really was limited. I mean, you could look at games like what Rockstar was able to take advantage of on the PS3 and 360 with GTA 5, compared to GTA 5 on the PS4, the Xbox One. Realistically, they didn't have that much of better worlds. It was much more a graphic upgrade. However, this time around, because of this better CPU, we're going to see much more detailed worlds and a lot more in that sort of simulation space, because it straight up has the same level of CPU horsepower as a high-end gaming PC. Now, of course, we can't talk about brand new consoles without talking about the graphics. And in this case, both the PS5 as well as Series X are taking advantage of AMD's RDNA 2.0 graphics. Now, this is pretty cutting edge stuff. It's not even out in the PC space, although it will likely be coming out around the time these consoles launch later this year. But there are a few major improvements. First of all is the fact that it is a new architecture with better clock-for-clock performance. So you can look at all like the teraflop numbers and stuff, but that's not directly equivalent to last generation consoles. On top of that, it does have a lot of built-in new features, such as of course ray tracing, which will really, I think, become a much more standard thing going into the next few years, with the consoles having it, with PCs pretty much having it across the board. And Sony spent a lot of time working on their audio engine, which is of course built into the GPU. But beyond that, what my sort of real takeaway here is that while yes, we will have games that look better, right? We will have games that have better lighting, which will be a major advantage. We'll have more detailed textures, all that kind of stuff, right? That's stuff that is coming in this generation, full stop. But instead, my thought is that they're going to focus on the actual fidelity of the experience. So the Xbox Series X as well as the PlayStation 5 both support 8K. We could see higher resolution stuff. I don't think that's going to happen though. Instead, my thought is a lot of developers are going to focus much more on the frame rate of their games. So you look at this generation, which is very much overwhelmed with 30 FPS titles. That's fine if you're playing some simple story-based game, or that's okay. But when you get your controller in your hand, you have like a 120 hertz panel in front of you, and you're playing that new Call of Duty, that's a real upgrade in the experience, right? I mean, this is something that the PC space has been pioneering for quite a while. So I wouldn't be surprised one bit to see all this extra graphics horsepower, all the new CPU, all the new sort of technology that's going into these consoles, focusing less on resolution and more on frame rate. I can see plenty of games taking advantage of 1080p or 1440p for the resolution, but cranking out full 120 FPS, especially in their multiplayer modes. And when I think about what's gonna sell these new consoles, what really makes this sort of worth upgrading over your Xbox One or your PS4 or your Wii U or your Switch or whatever the case is, it's going to be these experiences that we haven't previously been able to see. Are you gonna wanna play your 30 FPS game when your friend with the PS5 is playing at 120 FPS? I don't think so. Well, if your friend's bragging about his frame rate though, you probably sounds annoying. So we know that the PlayStation 5 has what is known as a variable clock speed for both its CPU and its graphics. Now this is not a new concept, right? Especially when you look at mobile devices, that is completely standard, right? Your phone, your laptop, whatever the case is, will almost definitely boost to a really high clock speed. However, it will do that by taking up a lot of power, and then once either the power or the thermals catch up, it will then start to slow down just a little bit based on if you're really cranking it for a very long period of time. For a mobile device, that makes perfect sense. You're opening up a web page, you boost up to 100, you have a really high clock speed, the web page is done loading, and it comes back down, right? That makes complete sense. However, what doesn't make sense is when you take advantage of that same principle, at least in theory, mind you, I haven't spent time with the PS5 yet, just sort of heard rumors, but generally speaking, I don't think that makes quite as much sense on a game console, which is generally speaking running very close to 100% at all times. So there have been a fair few rumors from developers that it is difficult to develop for the PlayStation 5 because it does have a variable clock speed, right? Now this is not even something new for the PC space. Some graphics cards will be able to boost a little bit higher, but generally speaking, it'll boost to a pretty consistent level of performance. And obviously console games are hyper optimized to take the absolute best advantage of the hardware that they have. But what I see happening here is that while Sony has taken advantage of things like Smart Shift, which is AMD's technology, to allow the CPU and GPU to work together, it gives some additional ability for the console to give you more performance. But what it really seems like to me is that Microsoft probably spent more money to get a bigger SoC, which can just sit at a high clock speed, period, pretty much no matter what. Whereas Sony has a little bit of a smaller chip, likely is going to have a smaller console, which is an advantage. But to get to that point, to really push everything they could out of the chip, they're having to really crank it up to 11, and there are definitely going to be some limits where it's going to be like, and obviously you're going to have performance differences. Did I just make the noise? I accidentally made the noise when I was like,
You did.
I make noises a lot. Even with today's event, we still don't know a lot about the PlayStation 5. So something like the price, I think, is something that Sony and Microsoft are gonna play chicken to see who can reveal last. Who knows if there's even some wiggle room on what they're actually going to price these things at. That's something I think we're going to see a little bit later. We know that the PS5 will support some number of PS4 games. This makes sense. It's going from an AMD x86 architecture to a upgraded version of that same architecture. There's no reason why PlayStation 4 games won't work, short of obviously making sure that they've been tested and there's the back compatible sort of layer available. But what we don't know is what that actually looks like. They seem to say that most of the most popular games will be optimized first. Is there going to be a point where all PS4 games are playable on the PS5? Is there going to be some way to know? Do you have to Google it, or do you put your PS4 disc in and find out? That I'm very curious to see, as well as what the process looks like. If the PlayStation 5 needs to download a patch, if you need to wait for OS updates to sort of better support more games. I'm really curious about that. I'm also curious if there's any older backwards compatibility that Sony may add, either now or later in the future. Another thing I'm very curious about with the PS5 is what the software looks like. So Sony's done a great job with software since PS3. I love the PS3 interface even to this day. I still feel like it's super intuitive, even though toward the end it got a little long and complicated. PS4, I think, is also a pretty clean OS. But sort of my bigger question is not necessarily just what the design will be, but more so what Sony's plan for the PS5 really is. So with the PS3, it sort of struck this nice balance between, obviously it was a very serious gaming machine, but it had a lot of other very nice features, right? Obviously it had the Blu-ray drive, you later on in the generation had like Netflix and all the sort of the streaming video. I mean, you had a freaking compact flash card slot on the first fat PS3, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that they were doing, but gaming was very much the focus. For the PS4, especially when you contrast that with the Xbox One, it was a gaming console first and foremost, right? Yes, you could still watch YouTube and Netflix. Yes, you could still watch a Blu-ray. But with the PlayStation 5, and considering that this is going to be the generation that's going to be living in our living rooms for the next potentially decade, I'm curious to see, are they going to push more of the entertainment aspect? I mean, I expect all the usual suspects of Disney Plus and HBO Now and all this kind of stuff will be on the PS5. But are they going to do anything else beyond just cater to the hardcore gamers? Is Sony going to take advantage of their massive libraries to try to make this more of a computer or make it more capable of being like your all-in-one entertainment system? Or are they going to stick with what they know, what they feel comfortable with, which is making a games console first and everything else second? I don't know. I would guess that that's probably the answer, but there's still a lot of things that we really do not know about the PS5 until Sony decides to drop 5 more events on us or just release the thing. I mean, I prefer they release the thing, but you know, I'll make as many videos as I need to as they trickle out information.